The winter hit differently at 8,000 feet in the Wind River Mountains. Cold behaved differently up there. It didn't just settle in at night and retreat by morning. It stayed. It pressed into wood. It crept through gaps you didn't know existed. It waited. Jacob Petro learned this his first December in 1884, when frost formed inside his cabin walls and his water bucket froze solid 3 feet from his wood stove. Not outside, inside. He had built exactly the way every homesteader was told to build. Tight-fitted logs, mud and moss chinking, a cast-iron stove hauled in by wagon at enormous cost, a plank floor raised on joists, a wooden bed frame lifted safely away from the fire. Standard, trusted, approved. By February, he had burned through more firewood than 2 men should have needed, yet still woke every morning stiff, aching, and shivering beneath layers of quilts that never quite warmed. And he wasn't alone. Every cabin scattered through the valley fought the same losing battle against the mountain cold. Men fed their stoves through the night, waking hourly to keep the fire alive. Women wrapped infants in wool and prayed the cough would pass. Water froze, food spoiled. Condensation turned to ice along interior walls, dripping back down as the fire flared, only to freeze again by morning. The cabins looked solid from the outside, but inside they failed the same way, again and again. Spring couldn't come fast enough. When it finally did, Jacob didn't complain. He didn't boast, and he didn't announce what he was about to do. He simply stopped rebuilding the same way everyone else did. Instead, he remembered something most men had dismissed years earlier. Stories his grandfather used to tell. Stories about stone and clay. Stories about sleeping warm while snow piled against the walls. Stories the other settlers had laughed at. Jacob's grandfather, Dmitri Petro, had come from the Carpathian Mountains in Eastern Europe, a place where winter was not a season, but a condition of life. There, homes weren't heated by air, they were heated by mass. Clay ovens, stone benches, masonry structures so heavy they took days to warm, but once warm, refused to cool. Families slept on them, children played on them, meals were cooked on them. One fire in the evening carried them through the night. On the American frontier, that idea sounded ridiculous. Here, men built fast, they built light, they built to move. Heavy stone meant permanence, permanence meant commitment, and commitment felt dangerous to people who expected to leave as quickly as they arrived. When Jacob first mentioned his grandfather's methods at a community gathering that winter, the response was immediate: laughter. One man said he wasn't building a castle. Another said stone beds were for peasants and animals. A third said hauling rock was a waste of strength better spent clearing land. Someone joked that Jacob wanted to sleep in a fireplace. No one asked how it worked. They didn't need to. They already knew it wouldn't. That spring, while his neighbors repaired warped floors and re-chinked walls that would crack again by fall, Jacob quietly began gathering stone. He didn't choose just any rock. He avoided brittle stone that flaked or split. He ignored anything with visible cracks. He selected dense, heavy pieces from a talus slope miles away, hauling them one by one back to his cabin. Men passing by shook their heads. They assumed he was reinforcing his foundation or building a hearth too large to be useful. No one guessed the truth. Inside the cabin, Jacob pulled up his plank floor and dug down into the frozen earth.
18 inches. Deep enough that the cold soil would never fully thaw. Deep enough to anchor something permanent. He lined the pit with stone and mixed clay he dug from the creek bank, blending it with sand, chopped brass, and ash until it reached the right consistency. Not wet, not dry, alive in the hands. This wasn't mud, it was mortar. At one end of the pit, he built a firebox from the largest stones he had. Low, wide, deliberately compact. And behind it, instead of letting smoke rise straight up into a chimney like every stove before it, he forced it sideways, into stone, into mass. He created channels inside the structure, forcing hot exhaust gases to travel long horizontal paths before ever reaching an exit. The smoke didn't rush out, it lingered. And as it lingered, it gave up its heat. Stone absorbed it, clay held it. The structure itself became warm. This was the part no one understood. Frontier stoves heated air. Jacob heated time. By the time the smoke reached the chimney, it was cooler, slower, and stable. The fire burned hot and clean. The stone bed above the channels warmed gradually, evenly, and deeply. Instead of a wooden bed frame pushed away from danger, Jacob built his sleeping surface directly into the structure. A flat stone platform, 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, heavy enough that it took all his strength to set the final capstones in place. When neighbors finally noticed what he'd built, the ridicule returned. They said the stone would crack. They said the clay would crumble. They said sleeping on rock would pull heat from his body, not give it back. One man told him he'd freeze faster on stone than dirt. Jacob didn't argue. He waited. The first test came on a cold night in early April. Not the worst cold the mountains could offer, but cold enough. Jacob lit a fire in the new firebox using dry hardwood he'd saved all winter. The fire burned fast and bright. No smoke entered the cabin. The stone warmed slowly, too slowly, some might have said, but Jacob knew better. He let the fire burn down completely and went to sleep on the stone platform, laying his blankets directly on the surface. When he woke the next morning, the fire was long dead, but the stone beneath him was still warm. Not hot, warm. Warm enough that he hadn't shivered once. Warm enough that his joints didn't ache. Warm enough that he stayed in bed longer than he had all winter. By the second week, he was burning half the wood. By the third, less than that. Neighbors noticed the smaller woodpile. They assumed he was suffering in silence. When summer came, they expected the stone to turn his cabin into an oven. It didn't. Without a fire, the mass stayed cool. The buried structure stabilized temperature instead of amplifying it. Air moved differently inside his cabin. Moisture behaved differently. The space felt alive in a way others didn't. And when the next winter arrived, harsher than the last, something changed in the valley. Jacob's chimney barely smoked. His roof held. His water didn't freeze. While others fed fires through the night, Jacob slept. While others burned furniture, Jacob conserved. And slowly, quietly, the laughter stopped. That's when the questions began. Not loud ones, careful ones. How thick was the stone? How long were the channels? How hot did it get? How much wood did it really use? Jacob answered simply. He didn't call it innovation. He didn't call it invention. He said only that heat shouldn't be chased. It should be stored and guided.
The laughter didn't stop him at first. It followed him instead. Whenever Jacob hauled another load of stone back to his cabin, someone was watching.
sometimes from a distance, sometimes openly, leaning against a fence rail or sitting on a wagon tongue, shaking their head. Fieldstone was heavy work. Every piece had to be lifted, carried, and placed by hand. And Jacob wasn't hauling it to build a wall or a foundation or anything people recognized as useful. He was hauling it inside his cabin. Men passing by slowed their horses when they saw the growing pile stacked near his door. Flat stones, rounded stones, dark stones streaked with quartz. Enough weight, one neighbor joked, to sink the cabin straight into the ground. "Building a grave in there?" someone called out one afternoon. Another laughed and said he hoped Jacob liked sleeping cold on rocks. No one understood what he was doing, and worse, they thought they already knew why it wouldn't work. Stone, in their minds, was cold by nature. It sucked heat away. It belonged outside, not under a man's back in winter. Every frontier instinct said the same thing. Wood was warm. Stone was punishment. Jacob didn't argue. He kept hauling. Inside the cabin, he began by tearing out the bed platform he had built the year before. The pine planks came up easily. Beneath them, the air was colder than anywhere else in the room, moving freely under the floorboards, carrying the mountain cold straight into the cabin. That was the first thing he changed. He dug down into the earth beneath the floor, cutting a shallow pit where the bed had been. The ground was still hard with frost, and every inch took effort. By the time he finished, his hands were split and raw, but the cavity was ready. This would not be a bed raised above the cold. It would sit inside the cabin's thermal core. Jacob lined the pit with stone, fitting pieces together the way his grandfather once showed him, turning each one until it seated naturally. No rushing, no forcing. Stone had to want to be where it ended up, or it would crack later. Between the stones, he packed clay mortar mixed from creek-bed clay, sand, and chopped grass. Not lime, not cement, just what the land provided, the same way it had been done for centuries before iron stoves ever existed. The base layer alone weighed hundreds of pounds. Above it, he began building the firebox. This was where the ridicule sharpened. Neighbors expected to see a stove placed near the wall, a pipe punched straight through the roof. Instead, Jacob built the firebox directly into the stone mass beneath where he intended to sleep. A fire under the bed. That's when people stopped laughing and started calling it dangerous. They said it would smoke him out. They said it would collapse. They said the stones would crack and explode. They said the heat would either be useless or deadly, with nothing in between. Jacob listened, then kept working. The firebox opening faced the cabin interior, low and wide, built from the largest stones he could find. Inside, the chamber was shaped deliberately. Not a simple box, but a controlled cavity that encouraged clean combustion. But the firebox wasn't the invention. The path after it was. Instead of letting the smoke rise straight up and vanish into the chimney, Jacob forced it sideways. From the back of the firebox, he built a narrow channel that ran horizontally beneath the stone bed. 6 inches square, smooth clay-coated walls, flat stone ceiling. The smoke had to travel. It had to give up its heat along the way. That channel didn't stop at one pass. It turned, ran back in the opposite direction, then turned again. An S-shaped path buried inside the stone mass, invisible once sealed. Only after the smoke had traveled nearly 20 feet through solid stone did it rise toward the chimney. By then, it wasn't violent, it wasn't rushing, it was calm, and it carried far less heat than it started with. The stones did the rest. Every inch of that hidden path absorbed warmth, slowly,
evenly, without scorching, without waste. Jacob sealed the final layer with massive capstones, each one heavy enough that setting it required careful leverage and patience. The surface above them became the bed itself. Stone, clay, weight. No boards, no gaps, no air rushing underneath. When the structure was finished, it looked wrong to everyone else. A stone bench where a bed should be. A fire where a fire had no business being. A chimney exiting farther from the fire than logic allowed. Thomas Brennan came by one evening and stood silently for a long time. Finally, he said what everyone else was thinking. "You'll freeze before midnight," he said. "Stone steals heat." Jacob didn't answer. He waited for night. That evening he lit the first fire. Not a roaring blaze, not a desperate one, a controlled burn. Dry hardwood split small, carefully stacked, enough to heat the mass, not flood it. The fire burned hot for a short time, then settled. The stone stayed cold at first. That worried even Jacob, but he waited. An hour passed, then another. Slowly the surface of the stone bed began to change. Not hot, not even warm in the way fire feels warm. It felt steady, like something alive beneath the surface. By the time the fire burned down to coals, the stone held the heat. When Jacob laid his hand flat against it, he didn't pull away. He stayed there, listening. The cabin air felt different too, less sharp, less brittle. The heat wasn't pooling near the ceiling or blasting one corner of the room. It was spreading outward from the mass itself. Jacob fed the fire one last time, then sealed the firebox and lay down fully clothed on the stone. This was the moment everyone expected to fail. He didn't. He slept. Deeply. When he woke before dawn, the fire was out for hours. The cabin air was cool, but not cold. The stone beneath him was still warm, not imagined, real. Enough to keep the chill from reaching his bones. Outside, frost coated the trees. Inside, Jacob stood up without shivering. That was the night the laughter began to die. Not because people believed yet, but because something they didn't understand had just worked, and winter had only begun.
The laughter didn't stop right away. For weeks, men passing his dugout slowed their horses just to look. Some shook their heads, others made jokes loud enough for him to hear. A few even warned him that stone beds killed men faster than cold ground, that rock would steal heat, that winter would turn his shelter into a grave. He didn't argue. Mountain men rarely did. They let weather settle debates. What those men didn't see was how carefully the bed was built. It wasn't bare stone. Beneath the surface slab sat a thick layer of packed clay mixed with ash and straw, sealed tight against moisture. Below that, a channel ran from the clay fireplace, not wide, not straight, but long and slow, forcing heat to travel before it could escape. The fire never touched the bed. The smoke never entered the room. Only warmth moved through the stone, slowly, evenly. By the first snowfall, the jokes changed. Men noticed frost forming on the dugout roof while the doorway stayed clear. They noticed steam rising when he stepped outside at dawn. They noticed he didn't rush to rebuild his fire every hour like everyone else. Inside, the stone bed held yesterday's heat, all night long. That was the difference. Most frontier shelters depended on constant effort. Feed the fire or freeze. Miss an hour and pay for it with numb fingers, stiff joints, shallow sleep. His shelter didn't demand that. Once heated, it stayed warm. Not hot, not smoky, just steady. And steadiness was rare on the frontier. The real test came during the first deep cold, a winter that old trappers later described as sharp enough to split green logs. Wind scoured the valleys, snow buried entrances overnight, fires burned faster, wood piles shrank, and men slept in short, miserable stretches. That was when stone beds were supposed to fail. Stone, they said, would leach warmth. Stone would turn against you. But when the fire burned down and the night settled in, the bed stayed warm beneath him. Not surface heat, deep heat, the kind that rises slowly through bone and muscle, easing stiffness instead of shocking the body. He slept longer, woke clearer, and when he rose before dawn, the shelter was still usable. No ice on the walls, no frozen breath clinging to the ceiling, just quiet warmth held in clay and stone. That winter, others didn't sleep as well. One man lost 2 toes to frostbite after his fire died in the night. Another abandoned his cabin entirely, moving in with 3 others just to share fuel. Food spoiled less in his dugout. Water didn't freeze solid. Tools didn't crack from cold. And word spread the only way it ever did out there. Man to man. Low voices. Careful questions. No one laughed anymore. They asked how deep the bed was, how long the channel ran, how often he fired it. He answered some, not all, because the system only worked if it was built with patience. Rush it, and the stone stayed cold. Cut corners, and moisture crept in. The mountain man understood something many didn't. Heat wasn't about intensity. It was about time. Stone didn't give warmth quickly, but once it had it, it refused to let go. By the second winter, others tried copying the idea. Some failed. They laid stone directly on earth. They skipped the clay seal. They built channels too short, venting heat before it could soak in. Those men went back to fires and blankets. But the ones who listened, who built slowly, who tested and adjusted, saw the same result. Warm sleep, lower fuel use, less exhaustion, and something else that mattered more than comfort: recovery. Frontier life broke men down. Cold nights meant aching joints. Poor sleep meant bad decisions. Bad decisions meant injuries. The stone bed changed that. Men woke rested, stronger, more patient, and that affected everything else they did. Trapping, hunting, travel. Survival wasn't just about staying alive, it was about staying capable. By the late 1830s, variations of stone beds and heated platforms appeared in dugouts and cabins across the frontier, some crude, some refined, many misunderstood. But the core idea stayed the same. Let the fire work once, let the stone work all night. That idea outlived the laughter. It outlived the man himself. Because long after he moved on, long after his shelter collapsed back into the earth, others remembered the result. Warm sleep through a winter that killed careless men. And that memory was enough to keep the method alive, even when no one remembered who built it first.
By the third winter, the laughter had turned into imitation, not open praise. Frontier men almost never praised another man's shelter outright, but they started building differently. They stopped laying beds directly on frozen ground. They began lining platforms with clay. They dug longer fire channels, sometimes too long at first, learning through trial where heat slowed best instead of escaping. And something else changed. Men started surviving winters they would have abandoned before. Stone beds weren't a comfort upgrade, they were a threshold. Cross it, and winter became manageable instead of crushing. What made the system powerful wasn't warmth alone, it was predictability.
When a man knows he will sleep warm, he plans differently. He works longer during daylight. He travels farther without panic. He rationed wood with confidence instead of fear. That confidence mattered, because panic killed more men than cold ever did. Historians later noted an odd pattern in winter journals from the late frontier period. Men who described stone or clay-heated beds wrote less about suffering, less about exhaustion, less about desperation. Their entries focused on work, routes, weather, plans. They were thinking forward instead of merely enduring. That shift was subtle, but it changed outcomes. The mountain man who built the original bed never claimed invention. He didn't write instructions. He didn't teach classes. He simply solved a problem he refused to accept. Cold ground stole heat, so he separated himself from it. Fire burned fast, so he slowed it down. Smoke suffocated, so he gave it a longer path. That way of thinking carried into other parts of survival. Men who used stone beds often built better food storage, better ventilation, better shelters overall. Not because the bed caused it, but because it taught them patience, the idea that nature could be guided instead of fought. Over time, settlers adapted the method. Some raised stone platforms inside log cabins. Others ran clay flues beneath packed earth floors. A few even integrated stone benches along walls that stayed warm long after fires died. The designs varied. The principle stayed. Heat stored beats heat chased. By the time industrial heating arrived, the knowledge faded. Iron stoves replaced clay fireplaces. Coal burned hotter but faster. Efficiency shifted toward fuel, not structure. The stone bed became a curiosity, something old cabins had, something people tore out, something historians misread as primitive. But the truth was the opposite. It was advanced for its time. It was survival engineering born from consequence. And today, modern builders rediscover the same idea under different names: thermal mass, passive heating, earth-sheltered design. New words for an old solution. A solution a mountain man figured out with frozen ground beneath him and no margin for error. That's the part most people miss. He didn't build the stone bed to be clever. He built it because winter doesn't care. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't forgive. It tests every assumption, and it punishes shortcuts. The stone bed passed that test, quietly, relentlessly, winter after winter. If you're enjoying stories like this, real frontier solutions that actually kept people alive, subscribe to Old World Survival. Every week, we uncover the methods history forgot, but survival never did. No myths, no modern shortcuts, just what worked when failure meant death. The mountain man never heard applause, but he slept warm while others didn't. And on the frontier, that was the only approval that mattered.
By the time the stone bed became something men copied instead of mocked, the frontier itself was changing. Settlements grew closer together. Trails became roads. Cabins that once stood alone now had neighbors within shouting distance, and with that came comparison. Men noticed which shelters stayed occupied all winter, which ones were abandoned halfway through January, which men emerged in spring thinner, quieter, but alive, and which ones didn't emerge at all. The difference often came down to one detail: what the man slept on. Most frontier beds were an afterthought, a raised plank, a pile of furs, sometimes nothing more than packed earth and hope. At night, the ground pulled heat relentlessly from the body. No matter how large the fire, no matter how thick the blanket, the cold came from below.
It always did. The mountain man understood that the fire wasn't failing, the bed was, so he reversed the problem. Instead of chasing heat from above, he stored it beneath himself. The stone bed wasn't just warmed by the fire, it became part of the fire's path. Flames never touched it directly, smoke never pooled there. Heat passed slowly through stone and clay, spreading out instead of escaping. By the time a man lay down, the bed was already warm, not hot, not dangerous, just steady. And that steadiness changed everything. Sleep became deeper. Muscles recovered. Illness took longer to set in. Frostbite became less common. A man who slept well made better decisions the next day. That mattered more than most realized. Poor sleep made men reckless. They rushed tasks. They wasted energy. They made bad calls in weather that punished mistakes instantly. The stone bed removed one of winter's constant drains, and that brought clarity. Clarity brought survival. Over time, the bed became the heart of the shelter. Fires were built to serve it. Cabins were shaped around it. Even cooking schedules changed, timed to load heat into the stone before nightfall. Men stopped feeding fires through the night. They let the bed carry them until morning. That saved wood. That saved effort. That saved lives. The laughter never fully stopped. There were always men who scoffed, men who said it was too much work, too slow to build, too clever for its own good. But winter answered those arguments every year, quietly, without debate. Cabins with stone beds stayed occupied. Cabins without them emptied. Some men learned. Others didn't get a second chance. What's striking looking back is how close this knowledge came to vanishing. There were no manuals, no blueprints, no official records, just patterns left behind in old shelters, stone platforms too deliberate to be accidental, clay flues too carefully routed to be mistakes, beds that stayed warm long after fires went dark. Modern researchers would later puzzle over them, assuming ritual, assuming superstition, assuming ignorance. They were wrong. This wasn't tradition, it was refinement. It was a solution sharpened by consequence. The mountain man never tried to be remembered. He tried to be warm. He tried to wake up alive. And in doing so, he solved a problem that plagued humans for thousands of years: cold ground. That's the truth behind the stone bed. Not comfort, not luxury, control. Control over heat, over energy, over survival itself. If this kind of forgotten knowledge matters to you, if you want to understand how people actually survived when there was no safety net, make sure you're subscribed. Stories like this don't come from myths. They come from failure, correction, and experience written into wood and stone. Next time, we'll look at another frontier solution that was mocked, ignored, and later rediscovered under a modern name. Until then, remember this: survival isn't about doing more. It's about doing the right thing once and letting it work every night after.